By the time Gideon Hart heard the little girl crying behind the freight shed, the last westbound whistle had already torn the evening in half, and there was something in that small, ragged sound that made the hammer go slack in his hand. She stood in one red stocking on the cinder path, one shoe missing, her coat hanging open in the cold, saying to nobody he could yet see, "I can't find my mama." And when Gideon rounded the corner, he found a woman crumpled against the freight wall with one hand still locked around the handle of a carpet bag, snow beginning to gather in the dark hair at her temple, as if the night meant to cover her before anyone claimed her. For a breath, he did not move. The iron smell from his forge was still on his sleeves. The train smoke drifted low and bitter. The child's fingers were chapped raw where she had been trying to lift the woman's shoulder all by herself. And there are some sights that do not ask your permission before they reach inside you. This was one of them. He crossed the cinders in 3 strides, set the hammer down without hearing where it landed, and dropped to one knee. The woman was breathing, but only just. Her lips had gone the color of ash. There was a split in the skin along her palm, and the hem of her dress was soaked where she had fallen in the slush beside the loading platform. The girl stared up at him with that stiff, frightened courage children get when they know crying has not fixed a thing yet. "She told me stay by the lantern," she said. Then she sat down and wouldn't get up. Gideon slipped off his coat and wrapped it around the child first. He did not think about it. Men who thought about kindness too long usually found a reason to stop. "What's your name?" "Lissie." "All right, Lissie." He slid one arm beneath the woman's shoulders and another under her knees. She weighed less than she should have. "You hold on to me. If you were listening from a back porch in Oklahoma, or a little kitchen in Yorkshire, or one of those Australian evenings where the house settles all at once after supper, tell me where the night has found you, because stories like this begin in lonely places, and lonely places feel smaller when somebody answers back. Lissie clung to his coat with both fists as Gideon carried the woman across the yard toward Doc Avery's rooms above the barber shop. The child's bare foot knocked against his leg with each step. He could feel the cold through her stocking. Behind him, the forge popped and settled, the fire going to waste for the first time in years. He did not look back. Doc Avery opened his door with a lamp in one hand and annoyance already arranged on his face. But that fell away when he saw what Gideon was carrying. Good Lord. She dropped by the freight shed. Alive. For now. The doctor stepped aside. Gideon laid the woman on the narrow cot by the stove while Lissie stood rigid near the door and watched with the full, unblinking terror of a child trying to understand whether the world had just shifted beneath her feet or whether it had always been this uncertain and she was only now noticing. Doc Avery pressed fingers to the woman's throat, pried one eyelid gently upward, then looked at the split in her hand. Exhaustion. Cold. Maybe fever under it. She's run beyond what she had to run on. He glanced at Lissie. How long since she ate? Lissie looked at the floorboards. We had bread on the train. That long. Then, the doctor muttered. Gideon set the child in a chair by the stove and crouched to pull off her wet stocking. Her foot was ice cold and nicked where the heel had rubbed raw. Where'd the other shoe go? She shook her head. I tried to keep up. Something moved in him, then that he had spent 7 years teaching into stillness. Not peace. Never that. Just a hard, dry place under the ribs where old grief sat like cooled metal. He had once had a wife who laughed while she kneaded dough and a little boy who believed every horse in town knew his name. He had once known what it felt like to hear a child's footsteps in his house at dawn. The river had taken both in one spring thaw, and after that Gideon Hart became the sort of man folks called dependable, because dependable men can hide ruin under work for a very long time. Doc Avery found broth from somewhere downstairs. Gideon held the cup while Lissie drank. She had the careful, guilty way of swallowing hungry children have, as if each sip might be one too many. On the cot, the woman stirred once and failed to wake. Any papers? Doc Avery asked. Gideon nodded toward the carpet bag. Still with her. Inside were 2 dresses folded small, a brush with half its bristles gone, a child's primer, and an envelope thick with legal paper. The name on the first page was Clara Whitaker. Beneath it, in clerk's ink already smudged at one edge by wet, was the name of a place Gideon knew well enough. The Whitaker boarding house, Willow Street, Cottonwood Crossing. Doc Avery looked over his spectacles. That place belonged to Alma Whitaker. Belonged. Buried her last week. The child looked up at the word buried, though no one had spoken it to her. Children hear the shape of truths adults try to keep wrapped. Before Gideon could say more, there came a light knock at the open door, and then the smooth voice of Amos Pike carrying up the stairwell before the rest of him arrived. Heard there was trouble at the depot. Amos Pike never hurried anywhere. He owned the bank, the grain warehouse, half the paper in town, and the kind of smile that let a man take your measure while making you think he was admiring the weather. He removed his gloves finger by finger when he entered. Like a guest at a supper he had every right to attend. "Well now," Pike said softly, his gaze settling on Clara, then the child, then the papers on the table. "This is unfortunate." Gideon stood. Pike's attention slid to him without friction. Miss Whitaker was expected, though perhaps not in quite this state. Poor Alma wrote to a number of kin before she passed. Taxes have been hanging over that boarding house for months. I'd hoped to help settle it cleanly. "Tonight?" Gideon asked. Pike gave him the faintest smile. "Tonight, I hope to keep a widow and a child from finding themselves in needless difficulty." Doc Avery snorted into his beard, which was about as close as he came to public speech-making. Pike set a small parcel on the table. "A child's shoes, cheap but new. Someone at the station said the little one had lost one. See that she gets these." Then, to the room at large, "When Mrs. Whitaker is awake, tell her I'll gladly discuss her situation." He left before anyone thanked him, which was perhaps the part Gideon trusted least. Clara woke near midnight with a sharp pull of breath, as if surfacing from water. Her first movement was not toward herself, but toward the chair by the stove. "Lissie, I'm here," the child whispered at once. The relief that crossed Clara's face was so naked Gideon looked away from it. She had a narrow face made older by fatigue and a mouth that must once have been quick to smile, because even now it looked built for better use than endurance. "Where are we?" "Doc Avery's," Gideon said. She tried to sit. The room swayed her back down. "The boarding house. I have to get there. Alma passed 6 days ago," the doctor told her plainly. "You can grieve that in the morning. For now you're staying put." Clara closed her eyes, and for a moment Gideon thought she might simply stop holding herself together. Then she opened them again and asked the practical question instead. "The papers. Safe." She let out a breath. "Then I still have something." At dawn Gideon took her and Lissie to Willow Street in his wagon. The Whitaker boarding house stood at the edge of town where the road turned toward the creek, a 2-story place with paint peeled down to gray and one porch post listing enough to make the whole front seem tired. The windows were dark. Frost had webbed the corners. Someone had tacked a notice beside the door. Clara read it once, then again more slowly. Gideon watched the color drain from her face in a way cold had not managed to do. Tax delinquency. Final sale notice. 3 days. Lissie leaned against her mother's skirt. "Can we go inside?" Clara tried the knob. Locked. Mrs. Talbot from the mercantile came bustling up the walk with a ring of keys and her usual way of looking at the world as if it had disappointed her personally and would be hearing about it. "I'd have come sooner if I'd known which train you were on. Alma left these with me." She glanced at the notice and clicked her tongue. "And him wasting good paper before breakfast." Inside, the house smelled of cold wood, old coffee, lamp smoke, and the faint medicinal sweetness sickness leaves behind after it has had too much say in a room. A row of hooks by the door still held 2 aprons and a man's hat no one would be back for. On the desk in the entry sat an inkstand, a cracked bell, and 3 ledgers tied in blue ribbon. Clara touched the ribbon like it might answer her. There were $9 in a sugar tin, a sack of flour gone gray at the edges, 2 clean quilts, and a winter's worth of work waiting in every corner. The roof over the kitchen had let in weather. The pump out back coughed mud before it gave water. Upstairs, 1 mattress had gone rank. Another room still held the shallow dent where Alma Whitaker had died alone while writing to kin too far away to arrive in time. Gideon stood in the doorway watching Clara move from thing to thing with the contained speed of a woman not allowing herself the luxury of despair because a child is watching. She counted blankets, checked the stove flue, opened cupboards, found nothing, and kept going. By noon Amos Pike sent his clerk with a neat note repeating his offer to purchase the property and settle the taxes himself. By afternoon the wind had sharpened. Lissie was trying not to cough. Clara had not sat down once. Near sunset, Gideon found her in the kitchen with one hand braced on the table and the other over her eyes. The boards were so cold the breath from the stove died before it reached the far wall. "You can't sleep here tonight," he said. She lowered her hand. Pride is a fragile thing until life has used it hard enough. Then it turns into structure. "We have slept in worse places." "Maybe. You're not doing it here. I won't beg a bed from strangers." He looked at the cracked basin in the sink, the child asleep on 2 chairs pushed together, the woman holding herself upright by force and will alone, and something in him stepped over a line he had spent 7 years guarding with both hands. "My place is 3 miles out by Cottonwood Creek," he said. "There's a back room. It's got a stove that draws proper and a roof that minds itself. You can make other plans when you've had sleep." Clara's jaw tightened. "Mr. Hart." "Gideon." She tried again. "Gideon, I cannot pay you." "I didn't ask." What she heard in that, or what she recognized, he could not tell. Only that the refusal rose in her and then wore itself out before it reached her mouth. She looked at Lissie, looked at the black windows, looked once at the sale notice still nailed outside her own dead aunt's door, and nodded. That was the point of no return, though none of them had words for it then. A widower who had locked half his house against memory took in a woman who had stopped believing doors stayed open, and a child carried her one remaining shoe out into the dark like proof that wanting a home and having one were not yet the same thing. Gideon's house sat behind his smithy where the creek bent through cottonwoods and the ground held heat half an hour longer than town. It was not large, but it had been built by a man who hated drafts and trusted hinges he made himself. The back room still held Nora's quilt chest and a rocker no one had used in years. He lit the lamp there without comment, set more wood by the stove than one night required, and left before either Clara or the child could thank him. In the morning he found Clara already up, sleeves rolled, hair pinned any which way, scrubbing his kitchen table with vinegar as if labor were safer than gratitude. Lissie sat on the floor in one of his old work shirts, feeding crumbs to the barn cat and whispering solemnly to it about trains. "You're a guest," he said. Clara did not stop scrubbing. "Then you keep poor guest books." By the end of the week, she had mended 3 shirts, sorted his accounts into piles that made sense, and found enough waste in his coal invoices to pay for Lissie's winter boots. Gideon had never considered numbers capable of malice before Clara spread his statements across the table and tapped one line with a flour-whitened fingernail. This interest was carried twice. He looked. "Pike says rates changed after the drought. Then Pike relies on nobody checking his sums." There was no bitterness in her voice when she said it, only precision. That, more than anger, made Gideon still. He watched her work in the evenings after supper, while Lissie colored figures in the margins of scrap paper and the stove clicked as it cooled. Clara's skill did not announce itself. It surfaced quietly, the way spring water does under dry ground. She could see where a copied number had lost a digit, where a fee had no matching county mark, where a date had been altered by the thickness of one pen stroke. Alma's ledgers from the boarding house told their own story if you had the patience to hear it. Guests had paid. Suppliers had been met. Bridge assessments, winter levies, road repairs. Pike's bank had taken them all in cash and noted them nowhere but Pike's own paper. Gideon shod horses by day and carried in wood by dusk, and all the while something warmer than comfort and more frightening than hope began moving carefully through the house. Lissie sang to herself when she laced her boots. Clara laughed once at something Mrs. Talbot said, and then seemed startled to hear the sound come out of her own mouth. Folks noticed. Tuck Morgan from the livery, a narrow boy with a front tooth chipped in a fight he had lost and bragged about anyway, brought up oats and stared openly at Clara until Mrs. Talbot boxed his ear. Pastor Green stopped by with preserves and asked no questions, which was his way of asking decent ones. At the mercantile, 2 women went quiet when Clara entered and louder once she passed. In a small town, a widow under a widower's roof becomes everybody's business unless she is poor enough to be invisible. Clara was poor, but not invisible. One afternoon Gideon found Lissie in the smithy holding a bent tin cup by its handle while the fire painted her face orange. "Dropped it," she said, braced for reprimand. He took the cup from her, set it on the anvil, and with 2 light taps of the hammer brought the worst of the dent back into line. He turned it in his hand, tested the rim, then handed it over. "A thing ain't useless just because it came through bent." Lissie nodded as if he had given her instructions for surviving weather. Clara had come to the doorway without his hearing. For a second neither spoke. The ring of the metal was still in the air between them, thin and true. It might have gone easier then, if the world had been the sort that allows damaged people to notice each other in peace. But Amos Pike did not become Amos Pike by overlooking anything that might one day refuse him. He arrived at Gideon's place on a Saturday with snow threatening and his deputy 2 paces back. He stayed on the porch, polished boots planted square, gloves tucked neatly in one hand. "I dislike bringing business to a supper hour," Pike said, though he looked not at all troubled by it. But time has a way of keeping its own ledger. Clara came to stand beside Gideon in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Lissie watched through the gap between them. Pike held out 2 papers. Final notice on the Whitaker property. And, regrettably, a call on your note, Mr. Hart. I've carried you longer than most. Gideon did not take the papers at once. You set this by design. Pike's expression barely shifted. I set nothing beyond ordinary consequence. Miss Whitaker may sell and leave with dignity. You may step away from a forge that hasn't turned a decent margin since before the flood years. We could make this painless. Clara reached past Gideon and took both notices. Her hands were steady. That angered Pike more than tears would have. "What do you want with Alma's house?" she asked. Pike smiled then, slow and practiced. "A widow does not always need the full map to understand the road. There's a spring on that lot. The rail committee wants water nearer the south spur. Improvement comes to a town by way of practical men. And if practical men have to lie on paper to get it?" Pike looked from her to Gideon and back. "I wonder whether you know how alone you are." When he was gone, the cold came in all at once. Clara laid the notices on the table, smoothing the creases flat with both palms. There's enough in Alma's books to question him, but not enough to stop the sale. Gideon stared toward the window where Pike's buggy had already shrunk to dark shape against the road. "I have money put by." She turned. "For your note. For what matters." And what matters? It was the wrong moment for honesty, which may be why it came. "Not letting him do this to you under my roof." She looked down at the paper because looking at him had become its own difficulty. "If you spend that money on us, you lose the forge. If I spend it on the forge and stand by while he takes you, I lose more." Toward dark, they hitched his wagon and drove to the boarding house with lanterns, ledgers, and every tool in the place that could mend wood, pump life, or persuade a room to be rented by Monday. Mrs. Talbot sent over curtains. Tuck hauled straw mattresses and pretended not to be pleased by being trusted. Clara scrubbed floors until the water blackened twice. Gideon reset the porch post, patched the kitchen roof, and brought the pump back from mud to clear water with numb hands and language Lissie was told not to repeat. By late Sunday, 2 rooms upstairs were clean enough for drovers or railmen, and the parlor stove gave off a respectable heat. Clara wrote a board sign in careful ink. Lissie drew a crooked flower in one corner because no one stopped her in time. At supper they ate at Alma's table under a lamp that smoked at the wick. Outside, the wind worried the eaves. Inside, for the first time since arriving, Clara let her shoulders rest against the chair. "I can take in mending," she said. "Boarders, too, if the rooms fill. There's enough to carry the tax if he gives no more trouble than the notice." "He'll give more." "I know." Lissie swung her feet. "Are we staying?" Neither adult answered quickly enough. "And maybe this is where I ask you something, friend, because the story turns here the way a wagon will chooses its rut. If doing the right thing meant risking the only roof you could claim as yours, would you keep your head down and call it prudence, or would you step into the doorway anyway and let the storm find you there?" The storm found them the next morning. It began with small things. The flour order Clara had placed did not come. Pike's clerk said the supplier had reconsidered extending credit. A rancher who had promised to take a room was advised, quietly, that the Whitaker place was under dispute and anything left there might be impounded. The pump out back jammed again. Only this time Gideon found grit packed deliberate into the valve. By noon Pike came himself. He stood in Alma Whitaker's parlor studying the wallpaper as if deciding whether to pity it. "I am still offering mercy," he said. "To both of you. Miss Whitaker can take train fare east and a month's lodging in Cheyenne. The child will be spared this strain. Mr. Hart gets 60 more days on his note if he ceases involving himself in bank matters that do not concern him." Clara went pale, but not from fear. "You mean if I sign away the property?" "I mean if you behave like a sensible woman who has had enough misfortune without courting more." Gideon took one step forward. "You can leave now." Pike folded his gloves. You should know, Hart, that sympathy is a costly habit in a man already behind. After he had gone, Clara stood looking at the front window long after the buggy wheels were no longer audible. When she finally spoke, it was almost to herself. I spent 2 years after my husband died taking whatever room was cheapest, letting people talk over my head as if I'd become part of the furniture. I promised myself Lissie would not learn that life from me. Then don't. She turned, and for the first time there was something like open anger in her face. Easy to say, harder to do when a man can take your future with his pen. Gideon went to the sideboard and set a small iron piece on the table between them. It was dark with age, threaded at one end, not much to look at. This fell from the undercarriage of the hired wagon you came in on. I picked it up the night I found you. Clara frowned. What is it? Brake pin. He tapped the shallow groove along its side. And this was filed nearly through before the wagon ever reached town. Not wear. Not accident. Deliberate work. Her breath caught. He knew you were coming, Gideon said. Or somebody did. Knew you'd reach the depot spent and late. Maybe too shaken to argue clean. Put you in a position where help from his kind of men would look like salvation. Clara sank into the nearest chair. My letter to Alma was answered by the bank. They said she'd been unwell. They offered to arrange transport from Rollins when I got off the train. Her voice thinned. I thought it was courtesy. Lissie, who had been coloring by the stove, looked up with the sharp stillness children wear when adult danger changes from weather into intention. That night Clara went through Alma's ledgers page by page. Gideon sat opposite her at the table, oil lamp low, while wind brushed the house in long cold hands. Tuck had slipped him a whisper at the livery that Pike's foreman, Reese Fallon, had been at the relay stable on the day Clara changed wagons. It was not proof. It was only one more thread. But enough threads begin to feel like rope if a patient woman is holding them. Near midnight Clara found what she had been hunting. Duplicate payment lists in Alma's hand, copied from guest receipts and supply invoices, each marked with county levies paid in cash to Pike's bank. The sums were too exact to be habit, too repeated to be error. Alma had known. I need a safe place, Clara said. There's the wall box in the office. Too obvious. Gideon thought a moment, then took the strongest ledger, the receipts, and the probate papers downstairs to the old service pantry where Alma had once kept preserves cool in summer. Behind the shelves was a shallow recess Gideon himself had boxed in years earlier when repairing termite damage. He slid the papers inside, set the boards back, and covered them with jars of empty mason glass. If he searches, he won't start with dust. Clara let out a breath she had not meant to share. You've become very difficult to leave, Gideon Hart. The words were quiet. The effect was not. He looked at her, really looked, and saw what fatigue had hidden the first night at the depot. Not fragility but endurance. Not softness alone, but a kind of disciplined kindness that had kept itself alive with no guarantee it would ever be useful again. He might have said something then that would have changed the rest earlier than the world intended. Instead, Lissie coughed upstairs, and the moment folded itself away. The fire came the following evening, just after moonrise. Clara had stayed late at the boarding house washing curtains, while Gideon replaced a warped door jamb in the kitchen. Lissie was meant to be asleep on a pallet in the front parlor with the cat tucked under her chin. The wind had turned and grown teeth. There was a smell first, kerosene catching where kerosene had no business being. And then Tuck Morgan came tearing up Willow Street on a lathered pony, shouting before he reached the porch. Mr. Hart. Smoke. The back corner of the Whitaker house was already lit from within, a red pulse behind the pantry wall, like some angry heart had been built into the boards. Gideon hit the steps at a run. Clara was inside, coughing, one arm over her face. The hallway filled with black faster than fire. Heat punched low along the floor, then rose. The papers, she gasped. Where's Lissie? In the parlor. No, she was. Above them, a child screamed once. The world narrows when flame gets hold of wood. Not to courage, to decision. Gideon grabbed the wool runner from the stair rail, threw it over Clara's head and shoulders, and shoved her toward the front door hard enough to send her stumbling onto the porch. Then he went back in. Upstairs the smoke was already thick enough to blind. He stayed low, counted doors by memory and wall studs by touch. The first room was empty. The second held only heat. In the third he found Lissie wedged behind the bed. clutching a rag doll he had never seen before, eyes enormous and soundless now that fright had taken her voice. He wrapped her in the runner and turned. At the foot of the stairs, through a rolling seam of smoke, he saw the pantry door below burst outward on a cough of fire. One more run, one more reach, and maybe the papers could be had. The child weighed almost nothing in his arms. The ledgers weighed even less. Men have ruined themselves before by pretending both could be saved. The stair rail groaned. A shower of sparks came down from above. Gideon pulled Lissie closer and ran for the window instead. He drove his shoulder through the upper sash, turned his body around the child, and took the porch roof on one knee. The world flashed white at the edges. Then he was sliding, boots failing for purchase. Lissie clamped to his chest while somebody below shouted, and arms rose to catch what the fire had spared. He landed in the mud hard enough to lose breath and thought together. For a second the night had no sound. Then Clara was there on her knees, dragging Lissie into herself with both hands, saying the child's name over and over in a voice that sounded nothing like speech and everything like prayer. Gideon rolled to one side, coughed black, and pushed himself up in time to see the pantry windows bloom orange. The hidden wall gave way behind them. Alma Whitaker's house, the one thing Clara had come all this way to claim, lifted into flame like dry paper. By the time the bucket line formed, it was not a question of saving the place, but of choosing what not to lose with it. They kept the spread from reaching Talbot's feed store. They got Mrs. Lusk's trunk off the upstairs landing. They saved the pump handle, the iron stove lid, 2 half-charred curtains, and 1 tin box too hot to touch that somebody kicked clear of the porch as the roof caved in. They did not save the house. When it was done, Clara stood in the street in a borrowed shawl, soot streaked across her face, and looked at the collapse of all her plans with that terrible composure grief sometimes wears when it has gone beyond tears and become a kind of stunned accounting. "How?" she asked, not loudly, not theatrically, just with the flat honesty of a woman whose strength had finally met its wall. "How do you fight a man who owns the paper and the fire both?" No one answered her. The beams settled inward. Somewhere glass broke in the ashes with a thin sound like a promise giving way. Doc Avery bandaged Gideon's forearms in his kitchen after midnight, while Lissie slept on the settle with her face buried against Clara's side. The child had not let go of the rag doll even in sleep. Clara sat very still, one hand on Lissie's hair, the other around a mug she had forgotten to drink from. "You ought to be laid up," the doctor muttered at Gideon. "I've been worse." "That isn't the recommendation you think it is." When Avery had gone, the house took on that deep, exhausted quiet that comes after catastrophe, when every board seems to listen for what will happen now that what already happened cannot be undone. Clara rose to put the untouched coffee aside. As she passed Gideon's chair, she saw his hands shaking. Not from cold, not from pain either, though there was plenty of that. Something older had come loose in him during the fire, something the sight of a child behind smoke had dragged into the open. She set the cup down and knelt by him with fresh cloth and salve. "Let me. I'm fine." "That is the most transparent lie you tell." He almost smiled. Almost. Then the effort went out of him. Clara took one of his hands. Burned grit lined the creases. The skin across his knuckles was reddened and split. Her own hand, when it closed around his, was not steady either. "My wife hated crossing the river in thaw season," he said after a long while, eyes on the stove. "Nora. She said the water had a mean look that year. I told her I had 3 teams waiting on shoes and the bridge would hold 1 more week easy. Sent her on to her sisters with our boy because I'd be along by dark." Clara said nothing. Silence is a kind of respect when truth is climbing out slow. "The bridge didn't hold," he went on. "They found the wagon pinned in willow roots 2 miles down. Folks said no man could have known. I decided they were kind enough to lie." The room held the crackle of the stove and Lissie's damp little breathing from the settle. Clara bent over his hand, smoothing salve into the burns as if gentleness could move backward through time and arrive where it had been needed years earlier. "My husband died in a room above a milliner's shop in Casper," she said. "Not all at once. 1 cough at a time. Afterward people kept telling me I was still young enough to begin again, as if life were a chair you simply sat down in a second time. I stopped unpacking properly after that. Thought if I never laid claim to a place, it couldn't hurt me much when it let go." Gideon looked at her then. The lamplight was low. Her hair had come loose at the nape. Ash still marked one cheek where she had forgotten to wipe it away. She was tired clean through to the bone, and still she was here, bandaging the hands that had brought her child back through a window. "Home," she said softly, more to the wound in him than to the room, "is the place your hands stop shaking." Something in Gideon's face gave way so quietly a stranger might not have seen it. Clara did. Some truths do not arrive to be admired. They arrive to be used. And if that line found you where you live, if you know what it is to be tired in more places than one and still keep reaching for tenderness, then take a second to like this story and stay with me for the next one. Subscribe if you want more evenings like this, because there are wounds that only quiet stories know how to touch without opening them wider. A knock came just before dawn. Deputy Henshaw stood on the step with the scorched tin box wrapped in feed sack and a look on his face that suggested conscience had finally gotten too loud to ignore. He was a broad man who kept rubbing at his mustache when he was about to say something decent and disliked that fact about himself. "Found this in the mud by the porch piers," he said. "Thought you might want to look before Pike's people start calling everything in that street abandoned salvage." Gideon took the box. One hinge had warped, but not split. He ran his thumb over the iron banding and gave a short breath of disbelief. "I made this." Henshaw shifted. "Then maybe you're the only one can open it without busting what's inside." On the kitchen table, with Lissie awake now and watching through sleep-heavy eyes, Gideon worked the softened hinge pin out with a punch and light taps of the hammer. The lid lifted with a groan of metal and damp paper. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth blackened at the edges, were not all of Alma's ledgers, but there were county receipts, tax stubs, room registers, a letter half burned through the middle in Alma Whitaker's hand naming amounts paid, dates collected, and one sentence clear enough beneath the scorch to make Clara's breath catch. "If anything happens to me, Pike has taken from more widows than God will excuse." It was not enough to win by itself. It was enough not to quit. The day before the sale became a day of knocking on doors. Clara went with Mrs. Talbot through town, gathering every receipt tucked into cookbooks, Bible pages, and cracked sugar jars by people who had long ago stopped believing paper could defend them. Mrs. Luss produced a board bill stamped paid twice. Pastor Green had church repairs charged to a levy the county never recorded. An old rancher named Ben Sorley, who spoke only after wetting his lips 3 times and staring at his boots through the whole effort, found a folded note in the lining of his hat showing bridge tax settled in cash 2 years running. Gideon went to the livery and spoke to Tuck Morgan alone. The boy kept his eyes on the straw. "I didn't know about the fire." "I know. But Reese Fallon told me to swap out the Whitaker wagon when the wire came from Rollins. Said the regular one had a bad wheel. Told me to keep my mouth shut if I wanted winter feed for my sister's mule." Gideon said nothing for a moment. The smithy behind them clanged in the wind. "Will you say that in front of others?" Tuck swallowed. "If I don't, he keeps doing it." That afternoon, Amos Pike took his seat at the front of the bank office where the sale was to be witnessed. He wore a dark frock coat and the expression of a man who believes the world has already agreed to his version of events. The townspeople came anyway, not because they expected spectacle, because by then too many of them had found a receipt in a drawer and recognized their own lives in Clara Whitaker's tired, upright face. Clara stood at the counter with Alma's scorched papers laid in careful rows. Gideon stood slightly behind and to one side, one hand flat on the tin box. Lissie sat on the bench beside Mrs. Talbot, hugging the rag doll and swinging her boot just above the floor. Pike lifted his brows. "Is this a protest or a pageant?" Clara unfolded the first receipt. Her voice, when it came, was calm enough to embarrass every man in the room who had ever mistaken volume for authority. "This is a record of county road levy paid by Alma Whitaker in February. Here is Pike Bank's mark receiving it. Here is the county duplicate showing no remittance. Here is the same gap repeated on 6 more payments. Here are 3 townspeople charged bridge assessment after the bridge work had already been funded by territorial carryover. Here is Mr. Hart's note with interest carried twice after renewal." Pike smiled faintly. "Widows and blacksmiths are not accountants." "No," Clara said. "But numbers are still numbers after you say that." A murmur moved through the room. Pike spread his hands. Clerical confusion. Nothing more. A shame Miss Whitaker has chosen to parade private bank records in public because grief has made her impressionable. At that, Deputy Henshaw stepped forward from the wall where he had been standing unnoticed. County clerk sent word from Rollins at dawn, he said, eyes fixed not on Pike, but on the paper in his own hand. Asked me to read this before any sale proceeds. Seems Miss Whitaker's petition reached him yesterday with copies attached. He unfolded the wire message and read that the county would suspend action on all Pike bank tax foreclosures pending review of remittance discrepancies. Pike's smoothness altered then, not shattered, just tightened enough for everyone to see the effort under it. This is irregular. So was collecting from folks twice, Mrs. Talbot said from the bench, crisp as snapped celery. Laughter, surprised and quick, broke in the back of the room. It was a small thing, almost nothing. But power shifts sound before it shifts paper. Clara placed Alma's half-burned letter on the counter. You told me sensible women accept what practical men decide. My aunt kept a better set of books than you did, Mr. Pike, and she managed it while running a boarding house with one stove and bad lungs. Tuck Morgan's voice cracked from the doorway. Reese told me to change her wagon. Every head turned. The boy went pale, but held. Said the first one had a bad wheel. But it weren't the wheel. Mr. Hart showed me the pin after. It had been filed. Pike looked toward the door as if Fallon might materialize and deny it for him. He did not. Men built on borrowed fear often discover too late that fear is poor loyalty once the room changes temperature. Gideon pushed the brake pin across the counter. I know metal. That cut was fresh. Same fine file marks as the one on Fallon's tack bench. You can fetch it if you like. Pike did not touch the pin. The thing that undid him in the end was not any single accusation. It was the weight of too many plain facts laid one beside another until even the men inclined to protect him could no longer pretend not to know what they were looking at. Receipts, dates, marks, duplicate charges, a filed piece of iron, a burned letter. The accumulated patience of people who had finally compared their paper. There was no great speech, no fist through glass, no hero's shout. Only Amos Pike removing his gloves very carefully and setting them on the counter because his hands had begun, at last, to show what the rest of him would not. The sale was suspended, then voided before sunset. The county examiner came 2 days later. Pike remained bank president in name for a short while longer, but folks stopped bringing him deposits almost immediately. Mrs. Talbot moved her account to a cash box under her store counter. Ben Sorley paid Clara directly to keep books for his ranch hands. Pastor Green organized a small lending pool at the church, and Gideon built the lockbox for it himself. Pike's office windows still gleamed when people passed, but more and more they passed without entering. There are men who fall all at once, and men who simply discover the world has gone on without asking them. As for the Whitaker place, the land reverted clean to Clara, spring and all. There was not much left standing but foundation stones, the kitchen stove, and a porch step blackened at one side. Gideon spent the next month raising a smaller house on the same lot with salvaged beams and new-cut pine. Folks helped because they wanted to, which embarrassed half of them and pleased Lissie very much. She carried nails in an apron pocket and appointed herself inspector of door height. When the front room was framed, Clara found Gideon alone at dusk setting the mantel. The air smelled of sap and sawdust. His shirt stuck dark between the shoulder blades. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. You gave up the money you'd put by for your note. He kept his eyes on the level. Looks that way. You gave Mrs. Lusk half the relief collection too. Henshaw told Mrs. Talbot. Mrs. Talbot told everybody. Gideon set the tool down. She lost her boarder's trunks in the fire. And you lost nearly everything else. He turned then, one hand resting on the unfinished mantle, a man so unused to defending goodness that he barely knew what argument it made. I had enough left to keep swinging a hammer. Clara came farther in. You could have taken all the praise, all the money, and every excuse. You didn't seem mine. She looked at him until the last of the day softened the lines work had carved into his face. That, she said, is why it is. There was no grand confession after that. The world they lived in did not traffic much in speeches, and neither did they. Love entered more honestly than that. In shared labor. In the way Gideon built the pantry shelves lower because Clara was short and reached high things on the sides of her feet. In the way Clara started setting out a third cup at breakfast before Lissie woke, because Gideon always came in from the barn cold. In the way Lissie, one ordinary morning, ran to the gate when he came back from town and forgot to put the mister on his name. Winter passed. Snow withdrew from fence lines. The creek thickened, then ran clean. By late spring, the new Whitaker house held boarders again. 2 railroad men, a widow traveling north to Sheridan, and a schoolmaster who claimed he had never slept so well as in a room where the curtains smelled faintly of cedar smoke and starch. Clara's desk by the front window filled with neat account books, not just for the house, but for neighbors who had decided fair sums were worth walking across town for. Gideon's corrected note shrank month by month now that its numbers told the truth. On a June evening with the orchard in first leaf and the air carrying that soft green smell cottonwoods make after a warm day, Pastor Green stood with a Bible under one arm, while Lissie scattered dandelion heads as if they were rose petals, and Mrs. Talbot cried in open disapproval of happiness, making a spectacle of her. Gideon and Clara married in the yard between the half-grown lilac and the hitching rail. It was not a fancy wedding. No satin, no band, just neighbors, the creek moving behind the willows, and 2 people old enough to know what they were choosing when they chose it. Gideon's voice caught only once, on the promise to make a home. Clara's did not catch at all until he slipped the plain gold ring onto her finger with those scarred, steady hands. And then she put her free hand over his, as if even joy needed anchoring. By harvest, the house on Willow Street had become the place folks went when they wanted a meal, a room, or numbers they could trust. Pike still kept hours at the bank, but his voice had lost its reach. Reese Fallon drifted west looking for a town that had not heard his name. Tuck Morgan hired on permanent with Gideon and grew enough to lose the look of a boy who expected the world to cheat him. Mrs. Lusk took a long room upstairs and taught Lissie to sew buttons on straight. Even Doc Avery, who trusted comfort only when disguised as complaint, admitted the place had improved the quality of his coffee stops. And one evening, months after fire had failed to finish what loneliness had started, Gideon fixed the chain on a porch swing while Clara balanced the day's accounts with Lissie tucked sleepy against her side. And when the hook took clean hold in the beam, he gave it one final, careful turn and said, "Anything meant to last gets fastened gentle," as the lamp behind them warmed the window gold, and the first stars came out above the rebuilt house. Next time, I'll tell you about the ranch widow who paid $2 for a half-starved horse and found a name burned under the saddle that should have been buried 10 years before. Until then, keep the lamp low, keep the door kind, and I'll meet you back here soon.